So when you think about where to get a great bagel, you probably automatically think of New York. And they do have great bagels, as I figured out in my last video. But are they actually the best? Because recently I've come across another style that's completely changed my idea of what a bagel even could be. They're a lot different than what most of us are accustomed to, and today I'm gonna put them to the test.
The Montreal style bagel.
Montreal style bagels.
The perfect Montreal bagel.
It's poached in honey, then baked in a wood-fired oven to give it its distinctively sweet taste and chewy texture.
Now, unfortunately, I haven't been to Montreal myself, so I haven't been able to try the real thing, but I was able to find a few pretty good videos online of Montreal's two most iconic bagel shops, Fairmount and St. Viator. And I also found a pretty good looking recipe from a guy who seems to have a fair bit of expertise on the subject.
Now, this recipe comes from a bunch of research that I've done over the last couple of years, and from asking endless questions while standing in line at the bakery, to the point where I'm sure the bakers are tired of me asking those questions.
And from watching all these videos, I picked up on a few things that are pretty surprising based on what I currently know about making bagels. Give me one sec. Now we're cooking. So we know with New York bagels, they use a high gluten flour in their dough, and they also use a relatively low hydration, around 55 to 60%. And that's what's gonna give us the denser structure that we're looking for in a good bagel. The only sort of unusual ingredient is the addition of some barley malt syrup, which is gonna give the bagels just a bit of sweetness along with a distinct sort of malty flavor. Montreal bagels though have a few key differences. They're still pretty chewy and dense like all bagels should be, so I do think they're using high gluten flour. I also still think they're using around the same 55 to 60% hydration, but what they don't do is include the barley malt syrup. Instead, they add a little bit of sugar and they enrich the dough with a bit of eggs and oil, which is very interesting because I've never seen that before in a bagel recipe. With a New York bagel, they're very rustic and chewy, largely because they're not enriched, so I'm very curious to see what effect that has on the dough. But that's really only where the differences begin, because New York bagels are usually mixed, then allowed to rise, then shaped, and then allowed to rise again overnight. Whereas Montreal bagels are mixed using those weird sort of old school mixers, which I'd never seen before. But once they're removed, they're immediately shaped and then boiled and baked. So they really aren't given that much time to rise. I'm not sure how long they stay in that mixer for, but that's pretty much the entire first rise, and then they get no second rise at all. So again, very interesting, and I'm guessing it's gonna lead to a little bit of a smaller and denser bagel when compared to the New York style. But now let's talk boiling and baking, because as we know from my last video, New York style bagels are boiled in a roaring hot kettle of water that's been spiked with a little bit of barley malt syrup, and they're boiled for just about 30 seconds to a minute. But in Montreal, they actually add honey to the water instead of barley malt syrup, and based on the videos I've seen, they seem to boil at a much lower temperature. I don't even know if you could call it boiling. It looks like more of a simmer. And because of that, the bagels stay in the kettle for longer, about 2 to 3 minutes. Then from there, they're actually transferred to a wood-fired oven where they're baked for about 10 to 15 minutes, as opposed to the 15 to 20 minutes in a more traditional bakery oven that they use in New York. And as expected, it looks like the two methods lead to pretty different results, but I won't know for sure until I give them a try for myself. But we can't have bagels without coffee, and that's where today's sponsor, AeroPress, comes in. Because if you're like me, morning coffee is non-negotiable, but I'm tired of overpaying for coffee out or settling for average coffee at home. But with AeroPress, I don't have to. It's a super versatile brewer that uses a patented 3-in-1 technology, which combines the best of several brew methods into one portable device. So whether I'm in the mood for a latte, a regular coffee, or even an iced coffee, AeroPress can do it all. And what I love about it is that it brews and cleans in less than 2 minutes. Just screw on the filter, add your coffee grounds and your water, stir and wait 30 seconds, then press and enjoy. Then just unscrew the filter and rinse, and you're good to go for your next brew. And this unique brew method leads to a delicious flavor. It's smooth, rich, and full-bodied without the bitterness and grit found in other presses. I mean, there's a reason why AeroPress is the best reviewed coffee press on the planet, with over 55,000 5-star reviews. My favorite part about it though is simply its versatility, because just by adjusting the amount of water I use, I can brew stronger coffee that gets me pretty close to a proper espresso without spending several $1,000s on an espresso machine. AeroPress is shockingly affordable, less than $50, and they've currently got a great offer for my viewers. Visit aeropress.com/Charlie, that's AEROPRESS.com/Charlie, to save up to 20%. It's time to ditch the drive-thru, toss the French press, and say yes to better mornings fueled by better coffee. AeroPress ships to the US and over 60 countries across the world. So thanks again to AeroPress for sponsoring this video, and thank you for your support. Now, let's make some bagels. So I got started on the New York bagels first, since it's a 2-day process. And the recipe I'm making is based on Claire Saffitz's recipe from New York Times Cooking, but I've made a few small changes to it. The main one being that I'm using high gluten flour, whereas she used bread flour, because I think that extra chew you get from the high gluten flour is sort of what defines a New York bagel. Then from there I'm using 2% salt, 0.5% yeast, 60% water, and 3% barley malt syrup, which I just bought on Amazon, but according to some comments on my last video, you may be able to find it at your local health food store or home brewing store. Although personally I haven't had a chance to check yet. But once everything is mixed together, I like to let the dough rest for about 30 minutes to make it easier to knead, because we are going to have to knead for about a full 10 minutes. And you can use a stand mixer if you prefer, but this is a strong, stiff dough, so I'd recommend only making it in small batches to avoid putting too much strain on the motor. I'd also recommend picking up a metal spiral hook if you don't already have one. I just got this one on Amazon, so I'll link it below, but it mixes a lot more efficiently than the plastic hook that came with the mixer. Anyways, once the dough is nice and smooth, we'll just let it rise until it's grown by maybe 25 to 50%, at which point we can go ahead and roll the bagels into the ring shape. Because despite what some people try to say, good New York bagels are hand rolled. So I'll just cut off a thin strip, making sure it weighs about 3.5 ounces, then wrap it around my hand and roll it on the counter like so to close off the bagel. And from there I'll toss them onto a baking tray, which I've lightly dusted with cornmeal, then cover them all up with a damp towel and throw them into the fridge for the overnight fermentation. And the next morning, before I can get ready to boil and bake these, I need to prepare my Montreal bagel dough. And for this one, I'm pretty much just using the recipe I got from that Glenn and Friends cooking video, but again, I did make a few changes, because he didn't specify using high gluten flour, but again, that's what I'm using here, and I'm also using 2% salt, which is something that he didn't include at all. Then I also upped the yeast amount slightly to 0.5%, and from there I'm using his recommended 7% egg, 1.2% oil, 4% sugar, and 0.9% malt powder. Then when it comes to hydration, his recipe only came out to about 53%, which seems low to me based on how the dough looked in the videos, so I think 60% seems a little bit more reasonable, and that's what I'm using for my recipe. And once the dough is mixed, I again let it rest for 30 minutes before kneading for 10 minutes, and then letting it rise for just about 30 more minutes. It's probably not quite doubled in size, which seems about right. It didn't look to be too airy when they were taking it out of the machines and dividing it up. Just gonna take it out here. Now, as we know, these aren't gonna have a second rise here, so basically once we divide them and roll them into their bagel shape, they're gonna go straight into the water to boil. And so for reference, these are my New York bagels that have been proofing in the fridge overnight. You can see they've blown up just a bit, which is to be expected for a New York style bagel. And that's different than what we're gonna see with these Montreal style bagels. Because when they go to shape these, what they do is roll it out the same way as a New York bagel, but when they go to wrap it around their hand, they leave a little bit of a bigger hole in the middle. And so you end up with a thinner bagel with a bigger hole. All right, and now that we got these bagels rolled out, let's go ahead and boil them. And like I said, this is where the next big difference comes in. Because in New York, it's traditional to spike the kettle water with some of this same barley malt syrup like what we used in the dough. The sugar in here is gonna help the exterior of the bagel to kind of brown, caramelize, and give you that shiny, crispy crust that you'd expect in a good New York bagel. And the Montreal style bagel uses a similar technique, but instead of malt syrup, they just use honey. So I'm curious to see what the difference is actually gonna be. I'm assuming there's gonna be a little bit of a flavor difference between the two. When it comes to the amount, I couldn't really find a solid answer on that. So I'm just gonna kind of go visually based on what I saw in New York and in some videos that I watched at New York bagel shops. So here I added about 2 tablespoons to my 10 cups of water, and actually that seems to be just about right. So I'll do about the same ratio with my Montreal water, and we're good to go. So first I brought my New York water to a pretty hard boil, then threw the bagels in for about a minute, flipping them halfway through before tossing them with some everything bagel seasoning and onto a baking tray. With the Montreal water, I brought it to more of a simmer, maybe around 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and boiled the bagels for 3 minutes, flipping halfway through before tossing them with the most traditional topping in Montreal, which are plain sesame seeds, and throwing the bagels onto a baking tray. Now unfortunately, I don't have a wood-fired oven to work with at home, so I'm doing my best job to simulate the 2 different baking methods here. So I set my oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit or 230 degrees Celsius, and for the New York bagels, I threw them onto my highest oven rack, whereas with the Montreal bagels, I threw them onto my second lowest rack. The idea being that since the heat in my oven comes from the bottom, the Montreal bagels should get that intense heat from the bottom element to sort of emulate that wood-fired effect, whereas the New York bagels will bake at a slightly lower, more consistent temperature. And just as expected, when I went to flip the bagels halfway through, the Montreal bagels had some nice charring on the bottoms, just like what I saw in the videos, while the New York bagels had a more uniform brown color. And sure enough, the Montreal bagels baked in about 15 minutes, where the New York bagels took about 20. Alright, so these Montreal bagels look pretty good. I already tore one open for some B-roll footage. You can see they've got that sort of non-uniform charring like what you get from a wood-fired oven. So that lower oven rack technique seemed to work pretty well. Probably could have made them a little bit smaller, but otherwise they seem to be pretty close. I'm actually surprised by how much they rose in the oven, even without that second proof. The New York bagels, on the other hand though, not super happy with how they turned out. They actually didn't really rise much at all in the oven. I'm thinking what happened is that I probably just overproofed them. They do seem to have a nice, shiny, crisp exterior, but I really don't think it would be fair to compare these two in this state. So what I'm gonna do here is make another batch and come back with those tomorrow. Alright, here we go. So these ones are looking a little bit better. I still would have liked to get a little more rise out of these New York bagels. For whatever reason, they didn't rise a ton in the oven. I don't know if it was the boiling because we boil them at such a high temperature. Maybe it was the barley malt syrup. It's just something I'll have to figure out as I go and perfect this recipe. Because like I said, the bagels that I tried in New York seemed to kind of blow up to where you couldn't see through this center hole even if you wanted to. Montreal bagels though actually look pretty good. Despite not being able to use a wood-fired oven, that bottom oven rack trick seemed to work pretty well. The one thing I'll say is that I had a little bit of trouble closing them off, as you can see, just because they're shaped right before boiling. I think you really need to make sure that seam is closed off when you roll them. As you can see, I made a couple different types of each for comparison purposes, so let's see what we're working with here. Start with the classics of each, so I'll go with the Everything New York first. Pretty solid. That's pretty much what I would expect here. Has a little bit of crispness on the exterior, a ton of chew. The one thing I will say is, you know, as I could kind of tell from the visuals, I would like it to be a little bit less dense than this. It also does have a little sweetness to it, a little more than I'd probably like. So I think that reducing the amount of barley malt syrup that I use will probably help to fix that issue a little bit. I might also want to try including a bagel improver like what they do at Utopia. I think that should help to get a little bit better rise and softness to the bagels too. Definitely not bad though. It's the type of bagel that I'm used to, but what I'm very curious to try is this Montreal bagel. Very interesting. It's definitely unlike any bagel I've had before. It's still got a really nice chew to it because of that high gluten flour, although not quite as chewy as a New York bagel. It's got a little bit of softness and kind of richness to it due to the eggs and the oil that we added. I mean, it's kind of like a hybrid between your typical bagel that we have here in the US and like an enriched sandwich roll. It's definitely not quite as enriched or buttery as like a brioche bread, but just a little bit more so than your typical bagel. Let me try the Everything though too, just for a direct comparison. I actually do really like this one though. I don't know if it's just because it's different than what I'm used to, but it's kind of nice that it's not as hard to chew through. Although, I mean, your classic New York or American bagel, still really good. I mean, that chewiness is what you'd expect. And if you're in the mood for it, it's great. It's hard to say which of these really I like better. Kind of the main differences I'm seeing though overall are just the New York bagel is gonna be a little bit denser, a little bit chewier, and it's gonna have a little crisper exterior with that kind of blistering and bubbling that you typically see. I'm assuming that's due to the higher boiling temperature and maybe the different baking method as well. But either way, you can definitely see a difference in the texture of the crust between the two. The Montreal bagel, on the other hand, is still pretty chewy, but it's got a lot softer, kind of more tender crumb to it. Again, still dense like all bagels should be. And especially because this is just sort of my version of it, it's not really an authentic result quite yet. But it definitely makes me want to go to Montreal to try the real thing. So it's definitely a recipe I think I'll want to work on at some point. But for now, my main focus is still on the New York bagel. So if you want to see my last video where I went to New York and tried some of the best bagels in the city, you can check that video out right here. Either way, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.